I've seen enough death in the void to know that someone has to witness it. Someone has to remember when the light goes out. My name is Rhian Valcor, Commander of the 7th Fleet, or what's left of it anyway. And if you're hearing this, then the transmission boys survived longer than I did. I'm recording this from the bridge of the Adamant Creed, flagship of a dying armada, floating in the darkness between stars that have watched empires rise and fall for longer than human memory can trace. Out here in Orion's belt, where the nebulae bloom like frozen gardens and the ancient dust of creation still drifts in clouds thick enough to hide entire worlds, we made our stand against something that should have remained legend. 3 months ago, I commanded 18 capital ships, 47 cruisers, and enough fighter wings to blot out the light of distant suns. Now, I'm broadcasting from a graveyard, surrounded by the corpses of vessels I once called home. I remember the morning it all changed. Lieutenant Morvek burst through my door without knocking, his face pale as moonlight, his hands trembling as he thrust a datapad toward me. The information it contained would rewrite everything we thought we knew about our place in the universe. Long-range sensors had detected an anomaly emerging from dead space, a distortion in the fabric of space itself, emerging from a region where nothing should exist. The readings were impossible, energy signatures that predated our entire technological understanding, structures that shouldn't be able to maintain coherence under known physics, and a fleet, God help us, a fleet of vessels that made our most advanced warships look like children's toys. They were massive, each one stretching kilometers in length, their hulls composed of something that looked like living stone fused with metal that breathed, pulsing with bioluminescent veins that glowed in colors I had no words for. They moved through space not with engines, but with gravitational manipulation that bent reality around them, leaving trails of distorted starlight like wounds in the cosmos itself. I ordered a full tactical alert within seconds. Admiral Thrace, my superior officer aboard the carrier Voidbreaker, contacted me within minutes, her weathered face appearing on my command screen with an expression I'd never seen before. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. A recognition that we'd stumbled into waters far deeper than we'd ever imagined. She told me intelligence had been tracking rumors for months. Whispers from outer colonies about lights in the darkness, ships that appeared without warning and vanished without trace, entire settlements going silent overnight with no distress calls, no evidence of struggle, just emptiness. The higher-ups had dismissed it as frontier paranoia, but now those ghosts were real. She told me there were records, fragments of data recovered from archaeological sites on dead worlds, texts written in languages that predated human civilization by thousands of years, all of them telling the same story about the architects, beings who had seeded the galaxy with life and then withdrawn, leaving behind nothing but ruins and warnings carved into stone. The fleet formed defensive positions around the primary refueling station at Mintaka, a massive construct of steel and polymer that orbited the blue giant like a mechanical moon, its docking bays filled with civilian transports and supply vessels that couldn't possibly evacuate in time. Captain Dreven suggested we abandon the station, cut our losses and regroup at a safer distance, but Admiral Thrace wouldn't hear it. Wouldn't abandon 20,000 souls to whatever fate awaited them if we ran. So we stayed. 18 capital ships forming a perimeter, point defense grids powering up, missile tubes loading with our heaviest ordnance, railguns charging with enough energy to punch through planetary crust, and all of it feeling woefully inadequate against what was approaching. I could feel the tension radiating through my crew. Ensign Talvir, barely 20 standard years old with fresh academy insignia still bright on his uniform, asked me if I thought we'd win, his voice cracking slightly on the last word. I wanted to lie to him, wanted to offer comfort and false certainty, but instead I just told him that we'd fight, and sometimes that's all we could do, fight and hope that it mattered. They emerged from the distortion, like leviathans rising from an ocean of stars, their forms so massive that our sensors struggled to capture their full dimensions, each vessel a grotesque fusion of organic and mechanical architecture that seemed to defy the very concept of design. The lead ship, larger than all the others, moved with a grace that something so enormous shouldn't possess, its surface crawling with patterns that shifted and changed like living skin, ports and apertures opening and closing in rhythms that almost seemed like breathing. I tried to establish communication, cycling through every frequency and protocol we had, from standard military channels to universal mathematical sequences that theoretically any intelligence should recognize, but there was only silence, a void of response that felt more ominous than any threat. Then something changed. A frequency opened, not through our communications array, but directly into our neural interfaces, bypassing every security protocol we had. A voice, if you could call it that, filled my head with sensations that weren't quite sound, weren't quite thought, but something in between that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. It spoke in concepts rather than words, images flooding my consciousness of worlds unmade, civilizations erased, cycles of creation and destruction that stretched back to when the universe was young and the first stars burned with primordial fire. The message was clear even through its alien nature. We were trespassing. We were children playing with forces we couldn't comprehend. We had taken something that belonged to them, and they had come to reclaim it. I tried to respond, tried to explain that we didn't know what they were talking about, that humanity had done nothing but try to survive in a hostile universe, but the connection severed as abruptly as it had opened, leaving me gasping on the bridge floor with blood trickling from my nose while my crew rushed to my side. Lieutenant Commander Shale, my tactical officer and the closest thing I had to a friend out here, helped me back into my command chair, her dark eyes filled with questions I couldn't answer. I could only shake my head and tell her to prepare for the worst. The alien fleet began to spread out, their movements coordinated with a precision that suggested hive mind intelligence, surrounding our defensive formation with the patient inevitability of a closing fist. I realized with sickening clarity that they weren't here to negotiate, weren't here to warn us. They were here to judge, and they had already found us wanting. Admiral Thrace ordered the fleet to target their lead vessel, to concentrate all firepower on a single point and try to break through their formation. I relayed the command even though every instinct screamed that it wouldn't be enough, that we were about to discover just how small we really were in the grand scheme of cosmic horror. When we opened fire, the universe itself seemed to recoil. Our weapons, designed to crack planets and vaporize moons, struck their shields and simply stopped existing. Not exploded, not deflected, just ceased to be, as if reality itself had edited them out of the equation. Railgun slugs vanished mid-trajectory. Missiles blinked out of existence. Even our energy weapons dissipated into nothing when they touched whatever field the architects generated around their vessels. Then they responded with weapons we had no names for. Beams that didn't burn but unmade. Their touch turning matter back into constituent particles and scattering them across space like cosmic dust. I watched the destroyer Eclipse of Reason get hit by one of those beams and literally dissolve, its hull breaking down into atoms, its crew dying so fast they never had time to register what was happening. 3,000 lives reduced to their base elements in the span of a heartbeat. Projectiles phased through our armor like it wasn't there, materialized inside our hulls, and detonated in ways that defied conventional explosions. Implosions that created gravity wells strong enough to crush entire decks. Antimatter reactions that converted mass directly to energy. Cascading failures that spread through ship systems like infections. But somehow, impossibly, it got worse. They deployed something that affected time itself. I watched the cruiser Harbinger's Fall age 1,000 years in seconds, its hull corroding, its structure collapsing, its crew dying of old age before they could scream. Then I watched the same ship restored to pristine condition, only to have its timeline reversed, watching it unbuild itself back to raw materials floating in space, the crew dying backwards through their lives until they simply ceased to exist. The psychological horror of that was almost worse than the deaths themselves. How do you fight an enemy that can manipulate causality? How do you develop tactics against foes who can make your victories into defeats by simply rewinding time and trying again? The Voidbreaker died first among the capital ships. One moment, it was there. Admiral Thrace's weathered face on my screen giving orders, coordinating the fleet with the calm competence of 4 decades of military service. The next moment, space-time simply collapsed around it, folding the ship in on itself like a piece of paper being crumpled by an invisible hand. 17,000 souls ceased to exist in an instant, and I felt each death like a physical blow. We fought anyway because that's what humans do, because we'd rather die fighting than live on our knees. Ship after ship fell. The Harbinger's fall, the endless vigil, the sword of mourning, the last defiance, each one a floating city of steel and flesh and dreams turned into expanding clouds of debris and frozen corpses. Lieutenant Commander Shale died when one of their beams cut through the adamant Creed's bridge, severing her in half so cleanly she didn't even have time to scream. We'd served together for 15 years. She'd saved my life at the Battle of Cassiopeia. She'd been the one who talked me through the dark periods after my family died in the colony wars. And now she was just meat and memory. Ensign Talvier lived only because I shoved him behind a console seconds before another blast vaporized the station where he'd been standing. The kid screamed, not from injury, but from the realization of how close he'd come to joining Shale in oblivion. By the end of the first hour, we'd lost half the fleet. 9 capital ships gone, 23 cruisers destroyed, fighter wings scattered and decimated. By the second hour, only 5 ships remained operational, limping through space on damaged engines, their hulls breached, their crews dying. By the third hour, just the adamant Creed remained, crippled and dying, its weapons exhausted, its shields failing, surrounded by the enemy fleet like a wounded animal cornered by predators. That's when I found the laboratory. It was in the deepest level of the station we'd been defending, behind doors that shouldn't have opened but did when I pressed my bloodied hand against the scanner. Inside, I found Dr. Korvax, the station's chief scientist, surrounded by equipment I didn't recognize and data I couldn't comprehend. She looked at me with eyes that had seen too much, and she told me she'd been studying the architects for 20 years. She'd decrypted their language, understood their technology, discovered why they'd really come. We hadn't stolen anything. We were what they'd come to reclaim. Humanity wasn't natural. We were one of their experiments, seeded on Earth millions of years ago as part of some cosmic trial. They'd returned because we'd passed the trial, achieved interstellar travel, developed advanced technology, proven we could survive and thrive, and now they wanted to harvest us, to collect the successful experiment and incorporate our evolution into their collective consciousness. But Dr. Korvax had found something in the architect's own technology. A weapon, but not in the conventional sense. A device that could rewrite causality itself, could change the past, could make events unhappen. The cost was absolute. Someone had to volunteer to be erased from causality entirely. Not just killed, but unmade. Every decision they'd ever made would be reversed, every action undone, every relationship severed. They would cease to have ever existed. In exchange, that erasure would create a paradox so fundamental that it would force the architects to withdraw. They couldn't harvest an experiment that had developed differently than they remembered. The contradiction would be unbearable to their hive-mind intelligence, would force them to retreat and recalculate, giving humanity time to prepare, to learn, to survive. Someone has to choose. Dr. Korvac said, her voice breaking. Someone has to volunteer to stop existing. I looked at the young faces around me. Ensign Talvier, barely more than a boy. The crew members who'd survived this far through luck and desperation. Dr. Korvac herself, brilliant and irreplaceable. I made my choice. Explain it to me, I said. All of it, everything I need to know. For 3 hours while the architects circled outside, probing our defenses, preparing their final assault, Dr. Korvac explained how the device worked, how it would reach back through my timeline and erase every choice, every action, every moment, how the universe would reshape itself around my absence, how everyone I'd ever known would remember me not at all, their memories reforming into new patterns that excluded my existence. How I would persist, briefly, as a quantum ghost, consciousness without form, awareness without identity, watching the universe I'd saved while being unable to interact with it, unable to be remembered by it, unable to exist in any meaningful sense. How long? I asked. How long will I persist? Unknown, she admitted. Hours, days, maybe longer. Long enough to see if it worked. Long enough to know if your sacrifice mattered. Then, let's begin. The process was agonizing in ways I couldn't have imagined. Not physical pain. The device worked on consciousness itself, on the quantum patterns that defined my existence, on the fundamental information structures that made me Rhian Valcor rather than someone else. I felt myself fragmenting, felt my timeline being rewritten in real time, felt every decision I'd ever made being unmade and reassigned to other people, to commanders who'd never existed until the universe rewrote itself to accommodate my absence. I felt choices I'd made at the academy, the decision to specialize in fleet tactics rather than engineering, the choice to volunteer for deep space rather than stay in the core systems, being redistributed to other cadets, other young officers who would now make those choices in my place. The Battle of Cassiopeia, where I'd saved 3 colony worlds and earned my first medal for valor. In the new timeline, someone else had commanded that fleet, someone else had made the tactical decisions. Every triumph I'd achieved, every moment I'd been proud of, all of it being transferred to phantom commanders who existed only because I was being erased. I felt my relationships dissolving, the quantum bonds that connected my consciousness to others being severed and reconnected to different people. My friendship with Shale reformed around someone else. In the new causality, she'd met a different officer during training, had formed a bond with them instead, had spent 15 years serving alongside them rather than me. They'd saved her life at Cassiopeia. They'd shared drinks with her in the officers' lounge. They'd been her best friend, her confidant, the person she trusted more than anyone in the fleet. And I felt her consciousness adjust, felt her memories reforming, felt my face blurring in her recollection and resolving into someone else's features. I felt her laugh at jokes I'd never told her because I'd never existed to tell them. I felt her grieve for losses I'd never helped her process because I'd never been there to offer comfort. I watched her forget me in real time, watched my face blur in her recollection and reform as someone else's features, and it hurt worse than any weapon the architects had deployed. Ensign Talvier's hero worship redirected even as I watched. The commander who'd shown him kindness when he was just a scared kid fresh from the academy. That wasn't me anymore. Some other officer had noticed his potential, had taken time to mentor him, had taught him that every life mattered and every sacrifice deserved remembering. Talvier would still become a good officer, still honor the fallen, still care deeply about justice, but he'd do it because of someone else's influence, someone who actually existed in the timeline he inhabited. I felt Admiral Thrace's final moments rewrite themselves. In the original timeline, she'd died screaming my name, ordering me to retreat, to save what could be saved, to ensure her sacrifice meant something. Her last thought had been hope that I would survive, that I would carry forward the values she'd tried to instill in her officers. In the new timeline, she died screaming someone else's name, Commander Sareth, who now filled the role I'd occupied in her command structure. She died hoping Sareth would survive, and I wasn't there to hear it, had never been there, would never be there, because I'd never existed to be there in the first place. I felt my parents' lives restructuring. In the original timeline, they'd had one child, me. In the new timeline, they'd had a different child, or no children at all. The universe cascaded changes backward through time, making every adjustment necessary to accommodate my absence. My childhood friends who'd known me, in the new timeline, they'd known someone else. My teachers who'd educated me, they'd taught other students. The colonists I'd saved at Cassiopeia remembered being saved by Commander Sareth. Every person I'd ever affected, every life I'd ever touched, every conversation I'd ever had, all of it being retroactively reassigned to other people. I was watching my entire existence being methodically dismantled and redistributed across reality, watching the universe edit me out of its narrative and smooth over the gaps my absence created. The pain wasn't physical, it was ontological, the agony of watching yourself stop being while remaining conscious enough to notice it happening. It was experiencing non-existence while somehow still experiencing, and then the erasure completed, and I ceased to be. But I didn't cease to be aware. I existed as consciousness without form, as awareness without identity, as a quantum pattern that observed but could not interact, could not affect, could not change. I was a ghost, but not in any traditional sense. Ghosts haunt the living, but I haunted causality itself, existing in the spaces between what was and what might have been, aware of both timelines simultaneously. I watched the battle continue, but differently now. In this timeline, someone else had commanded the 7th Fleet. Commander Sareth, a tactical genius who'd graduated top of her class at the Academy, who'd earned Admiral Thrace's trust through years of brilliant service, who'd made the same kinds of decisions I would have made, but for different reasons, with different motivations. She'd formed defensive positions around Mintaka just as I had. She'd given the same orders to concentrate fire on the lead architect vessel. She'd watched her fleet die ship by ship just as I had. But where I'd been motivated by a promise to protect civilians no matter the cost, she'd been driven by personal trauma from losing her home colony to raiders as a child. Different reasons, same outcome. The universe adjusting causality to maintain consistency while accommodating my absence. The architects paused. Their hive-mind intelligence spread across those massive vessels, capable of processing information at speeds that made human thought seem glacially slow, detected something wrong. A discontinuity in causality, a paradox in reality itself. The experiment they'd come to harvest had evolved differently than their records indicated. The humans they'd seeded on Earth millions of years ago had developed along trajectories that didn't match their projections. I could feel their confusion, even though I couldn't read their thoughts directly. It radiated from their ships like heat, like an emotional signature translated into quantum fluctuations that my disembodied consciousness could perceive. They'd been so certain, so absolutely convinced that humanity would develop exactly as predicted. They'd watched us for millions of years, monitoring our progress, confident that when we reached interstellar capability, we'd be ready for harvest. But now the numbers didn't add up. The timeline didn't match. Commander Sareth shouldn't exist, or rather, she should exist but with different capabilities, different achievements. The battles we'd fought should have had different outcomes. Everything was subtly wrong from their perspective. For beings whose existence depended on causality being consistent, on cause preceding effect in predictable patterns, this was intolerable. More than intolerable, it was existentially threatening. If they couldn't understand how humanity had developed, couldn't predict our behavior, couldn't be certain that harvesting us would produce expected results. Then their entire framework was called into question. They couldn't harvest what they couldn't understand, couldn't reclaim what had developed wrong, so they withdrew. Those massive vessels folded back into whatever dimension they'd emerged from, retreating to recalculate, to study, to attempt to understand what had happened. They'd be back eventually, maybe in years, maybe in centuries, but for now, humanity lived. I watched Commander Sareth coordinate salvage efforts, her voice steady over the comm channels despite the horror she'd witnessed. She was competent, everything a fleet commander should be. She'd lead humanity well into whatever future awaited them. I watched Ensign Talvier, shaking and pale but alive, helping to evacuate wounded crew members. He moved with mechanical efficiency, someone functioning on training rather than conscious thought. But he'd survive, would process this trauma, would grow into the officer he was meant to become. I watched Dr. Korvax stare at her device with confusion, unable to remember building it, unable to remember our 3-hour conversation about sacrifice and causality. She studied it for hours, trying to understand its purpose, reverse engineer its function. Before she destroyed it, she carved one word into its casing with a precision laser, while tears streamed down her face for reasons she couldn't articulate. Worthwhile. She didn't know why that word mattered, didn't know who it was meant for, didn't know that I was watching, that the consciousness she'd helped erase was observing her final tribute. But somewhere in her quantum consciousness, some echo remained. Some residual awareness that someone had given everything. I tried to reach out to her, tried to communicate, tried to make her understand that I saw her tribute and appreciated it. But I was nothing now, less than nothing. A quantum ghost observing a universe that had edited out my existence. I had no voice, no form, no way to affect anything, and I realized with terrible clarity, this was my eternity, not death, not peace. Just observation without interaction, awareness without agency. I would drift through this state until entropy finally claimed even the quantum patterns that sustained my ghostly awareness. Watching humanity live and grow. Watching the people I'd saved build lives I'd helped preserve. Watching them forget me, not because they were ungrateful, but because I'd never existed in their timeline. I drifted through the aftermath as a quantum ghost, unable to interact but able to observe. I watched survivors puzzle over inconsistencies in their records, battle reports that didn't quite add up, tactical decisions no one could remember making, victories attributed to officers who couldn't explain their own actions. The universe had adjusted causality, but not perfectly. Small errors remained, tiny contradictions that would puzzle historians for generations. I watched Ensign Talvier, now the highest-ranking survivor, take command and lead the remnants of the fleet to safety. He felt like he was forgetting someone important, someone crucial, but he couldn't identify what. The absence haunted him like a phantom limb, shaped his every decision, made him value every life under his command with an intensity his subordinates found almost religious. Somewhere in his quantum consciousness, an echo remained of a commander who'd once taught him that lesson, even though that commander had never existed in the timeline he inhabited. I watched humanity continue spreading through the stars, building new ships, establishing new colonies, always with a cautiousness that hadn't been there before Orion's belt. As if some part of the human psyche retained the lesson even though the teacher was erased from history. They didn't know how close they'd come to extinction, didn't know what price had been paid for their survival, but they felt it somehow, carried it forward as instinct. Captain Talvier, eventually Admiral Talvier, commanding humanity's border fleets, instituted protocols for honoring unidentified dead, ensuring that even those who died without identification received full military honors. His subordinates thought it unusual, this insistence on ceremony for the unknown, never suspecting he honored one specific unknown whose erasure had left a wound in his consciousness that he spent his entire career trying to address. He never fully understood why the unnamed dead haunted him more than those whose names filled memorial walls, but he continued the practice and taught it to his successors. Dr. Korvax's final poetry collection, published posthumously, contained verses describing a presence defined entirely by absence, a hero whose greatest achievement was becoming nothing so that others could remain something. The dedication contained only a question mark, and no one knew if that was intentional or a printing error, but it became iconic, a symbol for all the unnamed sacrifices that enable civilization to continue. Students wrote dissertations analyzing whether Dr. Korvax was making a philosophical point about heroism or describing an actual event hidden from history. I felt other ghosts drifting near me, crew members who'd been erased for other reasons, casualties of causality manipulation, consciousnesses that persisted briefly in quantum states before dissolving. We couldn't communicate, not exactly, but we shared something. A mutual recognition that we'd sacrificed, that it had mattered, that consciousness without identity still had meaning in some fundamental way. My final thought before complete dissolution was simply this: it mattered. The choice mattered. The sacrifice mattered. Not because it changed the universe's fundamental nature, but because it was the right thing to do in that moment. Because it preserved life over serving ego. And that's what being human means, making impossible choices and choosing the harder right over the easier wrong, even when the cost is everything you are. And then I was gone, truly and completely. Not dead, but simply ceased, the quantum patterns collapsing, the ghost finally fading, leaving behind only the species I saved and the civilization they'd built without ever knowing what they owed me. Which was exactly how it should be, how it had to be, how I chose it to be. The stars shine on, indifferent and eternal, and beneath them, humanity lives. And that is enough.